Thank you for joining us for the CSAFE All Hands meeting and sharing some thoughts with us today as we kick off CSAFE 2.0. If you want to go ahead and get started, that would be wonderful.
Sure. Thank you so much for having me. My name is Lynn Garcia, and I'm the General Counsel to the Texas Forensic Science Commission. It's a great pleasure to be here. I listened to everything this morning from when you all got started, and it's really exciting to hear all of the initiatives that have been underway through this collaboration in the 1.0 version, and now knowing that there's going to be funding for the next 5 years, it's exciting to hear about the new prospects. And the thing for me in particular is that I look forward to bringing some of this back to the laboratories that we interact with at the Commission all the time. So I'm going to get started and tell you a little bit about our Commission. We were created back in 2005, and the reason is that the Houston Police Department crime laboratory at the time was undergoing some real challenges. In particular, there were issues around the serology and DNA analysis being performed in the laboratory. There were some exonerations, people who had been wrongfully imprisoned, at least in part, based on the analytical work of the HPD laboratory. And so this created some serious concern among legislators, and they wanted some additional oversight in Texas. And so that is how our commission was created. And the other reason is because there were requirements in the Paul Coverdell backlog reduction program for independent investigation of professional negligence and misconduct. And so we fulfilled that role for the state of Texas. So just to give a little background, our commission has 7 scientists and 2 attorneys. And what do? All of those members are appointed by the governor of Texas. We accredit crime laboratories, and by that, what I mean is that we recognize the accreditation status of the labs based on the existing accrediting bodies that you all are familiar with, like ANAB and A2LA, for example. But we have additional statutory authority to perform audits and conduct reviews of laboratory quality systems as we see fit. And so sometimes we do additional work beyond what the accrediting bodies do. We also investigate allegations of professional negligence and misconduct that are submitted from the public and issue reports relating to those. And more recently, the legislature in Texas has required us to license forensic analysts. So that started in January of 2019, and we have a licensing program that includes all sorts of things, a general exam, educational requirements, including statistics, many of you would be pleased to hear. So we do a lot in relation to ensuring that that licensing program is successful. And then we have a training and education component. We work collaboratively with a number of other organizations within Texas, including the Court of Criminal Appeals. They have funding for education, and we work very closely with Judge Hervey from the CCA. So one thing I wanted to talk about a little bit is some of the value system that underlies the commission's work. We try very hard, because there is quite an extensive system of oversight already in place in some respects for forensic laboratories. We try to see where there are gaps and fill those gaps. And we see it as a form of risk assessment that actually helps the laboratories in many senses. Though it can be painful as the labs are going through an additional audit or an additional inquiry into something that may be happening, it actually ends up heading off problems that can occur later on. We try very hard not to reinvent the wheel, as you can see by our little bicycle triangle there. We don't reinvent quality systems. We supplement where accrediting bodies may have missed things. So something I thought might be helpful in talking about the role of our commission sort of national progress and how CSAFE's work fits into what we do is the sort of fundamental premise that no matter who I work with in the criminal justice system, almost without exception, there's a shared goal, right? Which is to ensure that the forensic science used in criminal proceedings is reliable, valid, and delivered in an efficient manner. We have obviously trouble balancing all three of those things sometimes. Resources are tight, and so sometimes it's a struggle to figure out which of these takes priority. But we try very hard to endeavor to get all of them right. So I wanted to use an example today of a case that we looked at the commission. A complaint was filed with us, and it was in the area of bloodstain pattern analysis. One of the reasons I chose this was because it's an area that CSAFE is focused on, and as you heard Hal Stern talk about this morning, quite a bit of work is being done in this area. And I thought that by introducing this example, we could talk through some of the downstream implications, some of the gaps, and where the rubber really meets the road when you go into the states. And the states are where the vast majority of crimes are prosecuted, state court level. So this is a case involving a man named Joe Bryan. There was a lengthy magazine-style article about this case published by ProPublica and the New York Times. And so I'm sure some of you have probably read this. So just needless to say, it was quite a high-profile case here in Texas. And to give you some background about the basic case facts, Mickey Bryan was murdered. She was the victim, the woman pictured in the photo I just showed you. She was an elementary school teacher living in Clifton, Texas, which is about 100 miles southwest of Dallas. So a very small community. And Joe Bryan, her husband, was the principal of the local high school. On the night she was murdered, Mr. Bryan had gone out of town, come here to Austin for a conference. Apparently it was a statewide conference for secondary school principals. And they had last spoken at 9 p.m. on the night she was murdered. And he was seen at the conference in the morning the next day around 8 a.m. When she was murdered, she was shot 4 times, 3 times in the stomach and once in the head. And it was a very, very bloody crime scene. So the authorities did not have any great leads in this case for some time. After the murder, the victim's brother, who was residing in Florida at the time, traveled to Texas. And because the authorities were taking some time figuring out leads and so forth, he turned to a private investigator, a former FBI agent. And one day they borrowed Mr. Bryan's car and drove around the local area. At some point, as he describes it, they stopped to relieve themselves on the side of the road. Their boots got muddy in that process, and they went to open the car trunk to find something to wipe the mud off their shoes with, and saw a flashlight in a cardboard box. And that flashlight had what they thought were specks of blood on it. The flashlight was sent to the state crime laboratory, so the Department of Public Safety in Austin, and those blood specks were tested at the time using ABO blood typing. The results were positive for human blood, and it was type O, which was the victim's blood type. So here's a photograph, if I can get it to work, of the head of the flashlight. And so what happened was that the brother turned this information over to authorities, and authorities contacted a bloodstain pattern expert. And his name was Robert Thorman. He was a police officer from a nearby county. The extent of his exposure to bloodstain pattern training was a 40-hour course that he had taken. And this was actually his first case. So a pretty significant case to take on as your first case. I think most people would agree. And he made a number of claims, including the fact that the pattern on the flashlight was backspatter. And for those of you who don't know a ton about bloodstain pattern analysis, backspatter is blood that traveled backward, as it sounds, at a high velocity from a target. So it's common in shootings, especially close range shootings. And this was consistent with the medical examiner's evaluation of the injuries that were inflicted on the victim. He made a number of statements during his testimony, including that backspatter has a limitation on how far it will travel, and that's 46 inches. He testified the lack of spatter on the handle indicated someone had been holding it when it was sprayed with blood, and so this would put that flashlight much closer to the crime scene than where it was found. And so the implication at trial was that that flashlight was present at the crime and held by the killer during the shooting. And this is a photograph of the scene with the different stringing techniques that were used by the expert. So we took a look at this case, and just at the outset, I want to make a very clear statement that our commission does not weigh in on guilt or innocence. So in any case, the forensic analysis plays a part. In some cases, it plays a minor part. In other cases, it plays a much more significant role. But generally, we don't comment as to that. We focus entirely on the forensic analysis and related testimony. So in this particular case, we worked with two different experts who concluded that there were many problematic aspects to Mr. Thorman's testimony. Those experts who we retained came from a law enforcement background. One did the training at the state laboratory for peace officers, for patrolmen, for others who had gone for the rangers, for people who commonly did this type of work, and another was a peace officer from the Montgomery County Sheriff's Office outside of Houston. So they took a look at this, and there were a number of errors that they observed. The stringing procedure was problematic. He used an inadequate sample of bloodstain to determine area of origin, testified way outside his area of expertise, making all sorts of speculative statements about whether the killer had cleaned up and changed clothes and so on and so forth. Things that you would not expect a scientific expert to say. He also made a number of statements about the position of the victim's body that our experts said were unsupportable. And similarly, classification of those specks on the head of the flashlight were problematic considering where it was found and the fact that it's a pretty small sample of stain, right? Also, the statements made about the killer carrying the flashlight and the distance airborne blood can travel, all of these things were speculative and certainly not supported by data, and certainly not supported by data available at the time. So ultimately, during this particular, the post-conviction proceedings related to this case, Tom Bevel, who is a well-known bloodstain pattern expert and does a lot of training in this area, came to Texas and testified that, yes, I gave this course, but the things that were said in this case go way beyond what we did in a 40-hour course and were inconsistent with the concepts that we taught. And ultimately, the expert in this case issued a recantation. This is just a photo. If you're wondering what happened to Mr. Bryan, he was let out on parole at the end of March. So this case left us with some big questions as the primary oversight authority for forensic science in Texas. And a lot of people in the community have high expectations for what we should do to respond to things like this when there's an obvious gap between what information the trier of fact heard at trial and what the reality is of the forensic discipline that was being testified about. So we've worked on this for a while, and we realized and saw firsthand a number of things that have been observed in the NAS report and other places, which is that there are some things that certainly can be said about bloodstain pattern analysis. It is, there is some value to those patterns, to the observations that can be made about the stains themselves. And so we want to recognize that that's true. The NAS report recognized that. Obviously, CSAFE is doing work to try to identify those areas. And when we talk to people who actually work crime scenes, they tell us often there are things that are obvious that we should be able to say when we observe the scenario at a scene. But what we also know is that some experts extrapolate far beyond that. So when we started to look at what should be done, we brought together the Texas Rangers, other law enforcement, and they said to us, yes, we have seen when we go out to rural areas, or we're all over the state, we have seen other people testify in a similar way with just a 40-hour course. So it's not like things have gotten better, but this problem has not been cured. And so we also have this very tough dynamic where a lot of the analysts who do this work don't necessarily have formal education or training in fluid dynamics or physics or any of those areas. Whether they should and what form that training should come in is a highly debated question, we realize, within the community. And we also know that there are complex patterns made when fluids exit wounds, right? And they're very variable. The published papers we looked at didn't do a ton to address our questions or concerns. But we did look at some things. And I put up here one of the papers that we looked at, done by Dr. Taylor and colleagues. And then I also put one of the items that Hal had referenced earlier this morning. So just extrapolating from, or sort of summarizing the work that was done in this particular reliability assessment, what we saw when we looked at this was that they had given 27 analysts 730 patterns, and there were two phases to what the evidence that analysts were given. One included rigid surfaces, so wood, wallpaper, chipboard, things like that. And the other category that was given to the analysts was more, I would say, trickier things to analyze, like fabric, jeans, sweatpants, clothing, all that sort of stuff. So not hard surfaces. But these are all commonly encountered crime scene evidence, right? So they put different pattern types onto these surfaces and let the analysts take a look to determine what conclusions they would reach. So in cases where there was a bloodstain pattern classification made by the 27 people who participated, in 13.1% of those classifications, the correct pattern was not identified for rigid surfaces, and a higher number, which one would expect, for fabric surfaces. But I can promise you that this information is not widely known in the court system, I don't think. It would be surprising to me that your average defense attorney, at least in our state, would raise this literature at a trial. Unlikely that they're even aware that a lot of it exists, right? So I think there's a big gap, certainly between lawyers and scientists, but also, as I'm about to talk about, between the research that's happening and what we would call the bench, right? So the other thing that this showed is that the more factual information that was given to an analyst, the more likely they were to make a conclusion leading in one direction or another. So they also tried to assess the impact of confirmation or cognitive bias on the analyst's work. So we saw all of this and issued our report, and then we got to thinking, what can we do? What can the Forensic Science Commission do? Because the paper that I just referenced had some very common sense conclusions in it, right? So limit the amount of contextual information that's provided. There should be a standard methodology, and certainly understanding what cognitive steps the analysts take in approaching a STAIN and review would be helpful, right? So all of these things seem pretty common sense. So from our commission standpoint, we have limited ability to affect change, but we try. So one of the things that first came up was, well, we accredit other disciplines through ISO standards. You know, ANAB has an accreditation program for bloodstain pattern analysis and for crime scene. So would accreditation be appropriate here? The issue with accreditation in Texas is that if we name a discipline as subject to accreditation rules and a practitioner is not part of an accredited entity, then that evidence and related testimony is inadmissible in the criminal case. So we had to think about who is it that is doing this work and what would be the unintended consequences of mandating accreditation from one day to the next. For an agency like the Texas Rangers, for example, they're a large agency, they have great available resources and funding to be able to make that happen. But there are much smaller agencies that may not. And so we had to really think through the implications of that. And also, what would accreditation achieve? What is accreditation? What are the limitations? What is the scope? It requires the agency to set up an SOP for how they go about doing things, but does it get to some of the fundamental concerns we have about developmental validation, foundational concerns, what can be said, what the limitations should be on what is said, and so on. So the other area, of course, would be the OSAC. And having participated in the OSAC for a while now, it's an incredible endeavor. And I think, you know, so important for forensic science. But there are some limitations. It is an SDO-based process, right? So it takes time to get these standards and guidelines through. NIST has been working very hard on making that go faster, but it still takes time. And the other thing we see often, because I'm on the legal resource committee there, is when you look at a standard or guideline, recently we reviewed a validation standard for bloodstain pattern analysis. And what you can see there is that the OSAC committees are primarily made up of practitioners, which has tremendous value. But there are some concepts, statistical concepts in particular, that the people who are working on these standards without a lot of assistance, education, and training are not necessarily going to be familiar with or accustomed to. So closing that gap between the statistician community, the practitioners, and looking at these standards and guidelines with an eye toward improvement, but also we have to make sure that anything we put out there is supportable. So that's a challenge with the OSAC process, but we're working on it. And then we also talked about other forms of credentialing. So as I mentioned before, we license analysts in Texas. So we're talking about developing what would essentially be a master's level sort of license that would create essentially a reservoir of very well trained and educated people who do this type of work, who do have the formal training, whether that be through university education or supplemental university type coursework, who would be connected to what CSAFE is doing, who would be participating in all of this. So we're talking about bridging the gap between practitioner and research. So those are some of the things we've been thinking about doing. And I want to talk about, you know, when we first started down this path of like, what are we going to do about bloodstain pattern analysis? How can we approve things or improve things? Sorry, we had law enforcement step forward and say, hey, wait a minute. You really need to think about, before you start mandating things, what the implications are. So one example would be, I'm sure you're all familiar with the horrifying church shooting in Sutherland Springs, Texas. And so some of our rangers and other law enforcement agencies said, you know, there was a lot of blood at that scene. And so whatever you're going to do, let's be thoughtful about how it impacts our ability to process the scene, about what we can say in court. We understand that there are complexities to this type of analysis, but we have to be careful about what are obvious things that should be able to be testified to, and what are the more complicated and difficult problems that should require restraint. And how do we make sure that that restraint is actually exercised when we're not in the courtroom all the time, trying to figure out whether we have yet again another person who did a 40-hour course saying more than they should be able to say, right? So these are very tricky problems that we're in the middle of trying to address. And then I just wanted to show you another friend of mine who contacted us. Sorry about the jumping back and forth. My mouse is highly sensitive. So we had a police chief from the city of Pecos, Texas, right over here. If you can see, I don't know if you can see my cursor, but it's way over here. And he called me and he said, I would love to be able to do a lot more training. I understand why you're concerned. We are out here in West Texas. The closest grocery store is 4 hours away. I can't even send my people to the things that you're talking about offering. That's how limited our resources are. Except we have a big crime problem because we're in an area where there's a lot of oil and gas exploration activity, and people come in, large groups of workers, and they work on things, and they sometimes spend their paychecks at the bar, and then there are fights, and then there's crime, and we are really strapped here. We want to do a good job. Please just be considerate. Whatever you're going to impose upon us, think about us out here in West Texas. So we have a lot of considerations in the area of bloodstain pattern analysis, much more so than your traditional disciplines that are performed in the crime laboratory, like drug chemistry, like tox, like DNA. You know, those problems to some extent are easier to solve than the ones that have these much broader implications. So when I saw I'm just reiterating from CSAFE's website how exciting it is to be able to see the research being done in the areas like the ones that CSAFE is working on. The benefits really can't be overstated for the potential use of these tools in the field, on the ground, by, I mean, not literally in the field and on the ground, but by the people who are doing the work. And I think I think our commission is at our best when we're trying to fill gaps, and I think CSAFE is also doing a beautiful job of identifying and filling those gaps and answering those questions that other oversight bodies are having a hard time answering, based on the fact that we're a tiny little agency. There are, 5 of us, and most of us are lawyers, so we're kind of useless for a lot of things. But to be able to go to CSAFE and say, what's going on with the research, and where do we stand, and here are the needs, and here's how we can connect you with people, even our friends out in rural parts of the state, is just super exciting, important work. So I'm thrilled to be able to talk to you all today, and I think my time is pretty much done. And so I just wanted to close on some things that I said to a congressional committee when we talk about why do we need CSAFE and why is CSAFE helpful? And it's because forensic science is very often referred to as a tool, right? Very, very infrequently is it the only thing in a criminal case. And it's true, these are important tools, but we have to make sure that they're helpful and reliable, right? These are the cornerstones of admissibility. So we need to move from subjective to objective approaches. We need well-designed experiments, objective measurements, transparent, validated, and tested methods. And we have to understand and express limits with respect to comparisons. And so the bottom line is we absolutely need the help of CSAFE and NIST, and I look forward to a really long, hopefully productive partnership where we can help bridge the gap to get all of these resources to the people doing the work on the ground. So I will stop talking now. I apologize for going a little bit over, and I'm happy to answer any questions.
Lynn, thank you so much for sharing your presentation with us today. We appreciate it. And there are already 2 questions in the queue for you. We have 2 raised hands. One is R. Cruz. If you want to go ahead and unmute and ask your question, that would be great. Okay, not hearing from R. We'll come back. Dr. Joyce, I see that you have your hand raised. Would you like to ask a question at this time?
To unmute yourself, either go to the bottom left of the screen, or on your photo, there's a, if you sort of hover on the top right, there's an unmute button. Can we unmute them? No.
We can enable them to be unmuted, but they have ultimate control whether they want to speak.
Ah, okay.
Okay, moving on. Kim, do you have a question? I saw that you had your hand raised.
There's Mike Russ in the Q&A.
Yes. Mike says, are you aware, Lynn, to what extent terrestrial LiDAR scanning is being investigated as a method for documenting and reconstructing blood stain patterns?
I am not a subject matter expert, so I unfortunately don't know the answer to that question. I'm sure that there are people, I don't know if there are any BPA experts on the call or people who are engaged in that type of research, but I do not know the answer, unfortunately.
If any of a blood pattern people has a clue, raise your hand or jump in.
Okay. I don't see any other hands raised. Lynn, if you will allow us, we would love to make your slides available to those that attended today's meeting. Thank you so much for the informative talk and for helping us kick off CSAFE 2.0. We really appreciate you being here with us today.
Thank you for having me. I'll get the slides out right now.
Thank you, Lynn, so much. It's always a fabulous talk, and we look forward to continued relationships and anything we can help with.
Okay, moving on into session 5 for the CSAFE All Hands meeting. We are now going to turn it over to Dr. Karen Kafadar from the University of Virginia to talk about latent print analysis.
Okay, can everyone hear me?